if you're studying virtual reality as an object of your scientific study, one very basic thing that you could study, that you could think about, of course, is what does it take to create a virtual experience, to create a virtual experiment, to create a simulation? What do you actually need? What are the prerequisites to create something virtual? In my experience, there are typically several things you need. And in practice, this is typically how it works. Of course, you can think of things that you need in terms of software and hardware. You probably need a computer. If you're making a virtual reality simulation, you need, for instance, a virtual reality headset to test your application. If you're making an augmented reality smartphone application, it might be nice to have a smartphone yourself such that you can test things. And also you need some kind of software, like for graphics design. Many graphics designers work with software that's called Autodesk Maya that really allows them to create 3D objects, look at those from all sides, craft those from all different angles. And a software that's more and most often actually used to create virtual reality simulations experiences is this Unity 3D software. We'll have a quick look at that later. But then in terms of people, in my experience, there are typically 3 types of people involved in virtual reality projects. Of course, indispensable is a graphics designer. Well, actually mostly indispensable. So if you have a certain idea in mind, for a virtual reality experience or simulation, then this needs to be designed graphically, right? Perhaps you want to make people experience a virtual restaurant. Well, then of course you need to make this virtual restaurant, right? You need to graphically design your virtual restaurant in 3D. That's typically the work of graphics designers. So they are typically very creative people who really often have had years of study to nicely graphically design different kinds of objects and environments in 3D, such that it looks very convincing and realistic often. Once you have those elements, of course, also in your experience, in your simulation, probably something is going to happen, right? At some point during the experience, something happens. In your virtual restaurant, perhaps a waiter or waitress will come by. This doesn't just happen out of the blue. Typically, you need to program this. So for instance, if the user performs a certain action, presses a certain button or so, then this and this will happen. This is typically something you program. And therefore, also often programmers are involved when designing virtual reality experiences. It's quite rare to find people who are both very good at graphically designing things and also very good at programming. So those are really different skills. And typically, there are also different people who are good at the one thing or at the other thing. So typically, both are sort of involved. Of course, it can happen that this is one and the same person, right? As long as somebody does it, it's fine. And then typically in industry, but also in research, there's someone who sort of supervises this process. So in industry, there might be a certain CEO in a company or in a startup company who has a certain idea, like, oh, I want to create a simulation in a virtual restaurant. Who then says to the graphics designer, well, can you make me a virtual restaurant? And then who says to the programmer, can you please program this and this and this that should happen in this virtual restaurant? Also in research, this is often how it goes. So if I have an idea for a certain virtual reality experiment in the lab, typically I don't have too much time myself to sort of start creating all this, and I definitely don't have the graphics design skills. Yeah, I don't have time because I have to create those nice videos for you. So I would typically, ideally, ask a graphics designer, can you just make this for me? And then I would sort of supervise it. Like, it shouldn't be too creative, right? If I want to have a virtual restaurant in my experiment, it should be not too exotic, such that people are constantly distracted by all sorts of things that I don't want them to be distracted by. And then ideally someone else or myself will do the programming. So typically there are those sort of 3 types of people involved, in addition to the hardware and the software. So those are typically really the basics. Right, so in a bit more detail, this graphics design is called content creation, right? So if you want to have any 3D objects or environments or agents or avatars, they need to be created, right? You don't get them for free, or mostly you don't get them for free. More and more, that's a nice thing. If people have crafted those, if people have designed those, they sometimes also make them available, open access to everyone in the world, so then you can sort of use them. But if you want something very specific, the chances are very high that you need to create them yourself or have them created yourself. Also, if you want to have certain animations in your VR experience simulation, these can be designed, right? So in those different types of graphics design software, graphics designers can sort of design those animations for you. If you want to have a very big spider that sort of walks through your virtual restaurant, this is an animation that can be designed first. Different types of software exist. I already mentioned Maya, that's often used by professionals. There's also Blender, different type of software here. Also, to some extent in this Unity software, you can still design certain things. As I said, typically done by artists, very creative people, content creators. And then apart from that, there's the programming. So for instance, in certain software, you then need to program where you want to have your 3D objects exactly in your virtual space. Program the procedure. What will happen at the first time point when the experience starts? What will happen after 5 minutes? What will happen if someone presses a button? Also, animations can actually be programmed. So if you want to have a virtual agent walk around, you can animate this graphically, but you can also program this. If your virtual agent inside of its virtual body has certain joints and bones, you can just program an animation. You can say at this time point, the legs of this virtual agent should start moving in this and this way. You can, in that sense, you can sort of program it if you don't want to graphically animate. And this programming is typically done in Unity itself or Wizard. Maybe you've heard about this. And as I said, typically done by programmers or researchers. Or if you're lucky, you'll find someone who's very good in graphics design and at the same time very good in programming. Or maybe you're the person who's very good in both graphics design and programming. You can, of course, also do some tutorials yourself. And there are also many YouTube tutorials here to start creating basic 3D objects in this graphics design software. If you have some time, you're interested in this, you can just start with a basic tutorial, start playing around with this yourself. And of course, this is very different from things like Photoshop or Adobe Illustrator, because there you're typically like creating 2D images, right? You don't turn the image around to look at it from the other side. Whereas if you're creating a 3D object or a 3D environment, you have to think about all your objects and your environment from all different angles, right? Because if you're done with creating your VR experiment or simulation, actually users may interact with it, turn things around, look at things from different angles. So in that sense, it's more work than just creating a 2D image. And then programming looks like programming. So in this Wizard Python-based software, they would really program things like, so you've built your virtual can of Coke, and then you say here in your programming code, you say, place this can of Coke there and there in my virtual environment. In different types of software like Unity, you can just place things in your virtual environment. You don't have to program the location of an object, but you can just drag and drop it where you want it. But still, many things need to be programmed, like things that will happen during the experience. Yeah, finally, as I said, more and more researchers, more and more people are just sharing their 3D objects that they created. I'm also doing this myself. When I've finished a research study for which many objects were created, I share them open access with other researchers. So here you see a couple of 2D screenshots of different 3D objects that we've been using over the years. And they take quite some time to develop, right? So for each of those objects, on average, I guess there's at least 3-4 hours of work in it. So you can imagine that if you want a virtual environment with hundreds of objects, it can take a lot of time, right? And some of those objects are pretty complex, like this bike you see here, or this guitar, or this plant here. It's not really easy to make. So if you can take one from a database that looks good, then that saves you a lot of time. So that's a nice development. And this also means that perhaps if you want to create like a very easy and simple first virtual and reality experience yourself, this would be a good starting point. So just take a couple of objects that have already been made by a graphics designer, start playing around with it in one of those VR types of software. Yeah, and see what happens.